Okay, so let's talk about our next collision. So we already did the collision for our enemy reacting to the player. We have our player runs into our enemy, and our enemy goes into a die state, so we get to see that reaction. Now, what we have not done is we have not done some type of reaction for the player. Now, I mentioned before that we could have a HUD, we could show health or hearts disappearing, but we do want to give some type of immediate feedback. So what I am planning on doing is doing some type of force pushback, and I'll show an example of that, and then we're going to develop that. Okay, so right now we are controlling what is happening to our player. We have built into the dynamic class for our player to be reactive to velocity and that type of stuff. So that's the easiest way that I think that we could tackle this. When we have an enemy coming towards us and they collide, yes, we are having our enemy react, but we want to do maybe a little bit of a force pushback, like the enemy hit us and kind of pushed us back some. And then because we're doing an infinite platform runner, we want to be moving back to that same position. So that's something that we're going to be playing around with, okay? Specifically for the player reacting to the enemy. So let's kind of look at some examples for that. Okay, so here is, and I want you guys to key in specifically on our player, okay? When the enemy hits, you see how we get that little bit of a pushback? That is, that's our reaction showing that the enemy or the player is hitting the enemy. So that's something that we want to do. It doesn't do that when we're not colliding. So anytime that we are hitting them, and we could do this in different ways with how we're kind of building this out. We could also guard against if we are successfully killing them, we maybe don't want to force pushback. So here, let's watch, we get a force pushback. Now let's try to jump on top of them. We don't see it so much. Okay, because it's got to be that they're colliding without my feet. I actually have a double jump set up on here. So that means that we can jump off of an enemy. Let's try to get that lined up. There, we can jump on their heads. So they could still end up dying, but we can use that to have a little bit of a jump. So in Mario, you might see where they're jumping on the Goomba's heads, that type of stuff. We can do kind of that same thing. But if we end up having it where it's hitting our head or our body, yes, we are going to generate some type of hit. So that's what we want to code, okay? Let me cut this. Okay. So let me move this over. For this one, now this is where we're at. We're moving. We are generating for them to hit. Now there is that flicker, and I'll just kind of show what we can do. There seems to be a little bit of a bug on the load, so let me slow it down so you guys can see it. It looks like it's flashing one frame, the very start frame, and then it's generating that we are having that hit. So I slowed this down to 10 frames a second. We'll watch his very first hit. He's going through the death animation, and then he flickers one frame back to his starting one. And the only reason why I know that is because if you're looking at their eyes, you'll see them light back up. Okay? So that is one of the ways that we can make sure that it's not going to do that, and I'll show you. For whatever reason, the values look like it's flagging too high. So here's an easy way to fix it. We go to the die animation. So I'll do enemy 1. If I bump that down to 0.4, let's watch. This is enemy 1, so he's the one that's gray. he will die and you won't see that flicker. See, there it is, it's good. But these other two, so we can fix those easy enough. We just go and we're just slowing down the animation, which is fine because we actually do want to see that. So we could have one of them do a slower death animation. So my enemy 2, that's the yellow one, is going to die a little bit slower. He's a little more dramatic. Oops, I slowed down the wrong one. 3, 5, oops, yep. There we go. Okay, now it's right. Now we're looking for the yellow one. So when we put that at 3, we see that flicker again. So there must be some issue with the math. We could sit down and fix it, but we just slow it down a little bit, all to 0.4. Math works out. We don't see that extra frame. So that's fine. All right, so this is where we're starting. So now we want to do some type of force pushback. We don't need to set up a check for collision for when the enemy is hitting. We just need to look at where we are already dealing with that collision. In this case, we are dealing with all collisions through the player, okay? Which means that that is where we are going to be looking at all of the code, okay? So if I am looking at my player state, we're not checking here in the build dynamics to check, we're checking our collision here. So now that we have all this, I can remove all of those pieces of code. I don't need to see that anymore. Just clean up my stuff. Okay, so when we have a collision, which would be inside of this, we know that there is some type of collision and I'm dealing with my enemies right here, okay? We also need to deal with our player. So we can build in some stuff. Now, we got to kind of think of what we want. Let me just make sure I'm looking at my notes. Okay. All right, so there's a couple things that we want to do. We know when we're creating a player that the player is inheriting from the dynamic creature who's inheriting from the dynamic class. So we have a position, okay? Now what we want is we actually want for our player, since we're doing this force pushback. Now if I was doing this for the enemies also, I wanted some type of force pushback, then I might do this for the dynamic creature class so I could apply it to everything. But I'm only doing this for the player, so I'm only doing this in the player area. What I want is basically I want a copy of the position, and I'll do that on the player's creation. Since the player is not moving around the screen, I want basically like a home position, and then if I do a force pushback and push him back, I can check if he's a certain distance away from the home position, and then I can return him back to that place, okay? Now remember, we are doing position and velocity through vectors, so we need to maintain those, okay? Now, if I do something like this, I say this dot home position, and then I just make it equal to position. This will not work. It will treat this home position as the same reference to the position that I passed in. It will make it a blanket copy. So what I actually need to do is I need to make a carbon copy of that position, which when we're dealing with vectors would not be written like this. We would actually use one of the built-in functions and make a copy, okay? So I would have a home position that I'm really only using for this force pushback. I'm making a copy of it, and then I'm continuing to pass that position in to the dynamic class. So everything else will be working the same, except now I have this home position reference, okay? What I'm going to do with that is I want to generate a force pushback. So I'm going to start creating some more stuff. I need to know if I have done a force pushback or not. So I'm not continually checking it all the time. So I'm going to write also another variable inside my constructor that's going to be force pushback done. Just blatantly obvious, okay? And I'm going to set that to true. So it's going to be default to true, so it doesn't happen. When I want to do a force pushback, I'll change that to false, and then I can have stuff happen, okay? So we need to do a couple different functions. So we're going to create a function called knockback. And what this function is going to do is all it is going to do is we're going to call it, and we're just going to change the x velocity of our player. Okay, and then we can take that velocity, just add it to our player. We don't even need to use the add force because we don't really need to take physics into this, but we could if we were designing it in such a way that we actually wanted to have that happen. We could also put gravity and different types of stuff. It really kind of depends on how we're designing our game. Really what I want, though, to happen, like I showed the example, is we kind of just have a pushback, and then we come back to the original position. So I'm going to scroll all the way down, and I'm going to create a couple functions. Okay, I want this knockback that I was talking about. I don't need any parameters for it. And all I want to do on this, and I'm just going to look for some value. So let's say this.velocity.x, I'm going to subtract whatever my velocity for x is, which should be at 0. Let's say I put 2 in there, okay? And that's what I want to fire when I apply it. So now I want to call this. So let's go to where we have some type of collision. So it's in here. We are dealing with a collision. A collision has happened inside of this bracket. This is where we're dealing with all of our stuff. If we hit an enemy, that's what we're dealing with here. And we also want to deal with if the enemy hit the player. So enemy hit player, do a knockback. Okay, so that is where we want to do this. So let's build that in. So all I really need to do is I need to then just ask the question. If this dot force push back done, and that's what we set at the start to true, okay? We'll start it as true. So we'll do it one time. And actually, maybe we might want to, yeah, it'll be true, so we're not doing, it's not going to change the performance, it's just how you understand it, if you wanted it to start as true or false. Okay, so that's what we wanted to call. All right, so basically we want this to only happen once, so then we're putting this switch in here. So we are saying, hey, I am starting as true, I'm doing a knockback, and then I'm changing this back to false. Force push back done is going to be false, okay? So now let's see this happen. This is, again, happening right inside of our collision. So if we have a head or a body colliding for our player to the head or body of an enemy, then we are doing a push. Now this is only going to happen one time because we got to additionally set, but I wanted you guys to see what's going to happen to our player. So the first one, oh, we didn't see anything. Well, that's because I changed the velocity, but at no point am I actually changing the position of the player themselves, because we have the update here. If I wanted to do an update with the dynamic creature or the dynamic class, I would have to specifically call it using super. In this case, though, I don't think we really 100% need to yet. but we do want to make sure that if we are changing the velocity like we did here, that we want to call it. So right after we have dealt with a collision, that means we've checked all of our dynamic classes, we've broke out of them. We want to check our stuff. So right here, outside of this, that means that we've checked all of the enemies. If one of them came back where we hit, we would generate right here. Okay, so after this is where we need to deal with that. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our position that we have for our player, and we need to add whatever our velocity is. Okay, and this is something that we haven't bothered to do with the player because the player stays stationary. Now, let's watch it happen, because we're going to have to create another function that we haven't dealt with yet either. Okay, we're dealing with a collision, and now he's getting pushed back, but he doesn't ever stop, okay, which is where we have to create some type of return to home function, okay? We want to basically add the velocity and then check if we are a certain distance away from our home position that we want to return to home, okay? So we could go ahead and write the stub of it first. How about return to home? This is the function that we want when we want to go back to our original home position. Okay, so I'm just going to add this underneath my knockback. I want this return to home function. Let's just code this one. Return to home. And in this one, we want to check. So if this home position, because now we have a reference to our original position where we were. If our x, and we could set up some type of distance so that it was continually applying that velocity, what we want to do is we want to change a couple values. So when we start sliding back a certain distance away, then I want to return back. So I can say, all right, you know what? When I am 50 pixels away or 50 units away from where my home position was to where my current position is, then I want to do something, or 25 or 100. It doesn't really matter. It's more of a look. I'm using 50 though. So this dot position dot x, if the home position minus that position, if that is greater than 50, what do I want to do? I want to deal with this. So I could say then that my current position for my player, my x position, is now going to be that home position. This does not complete it. If we watch it happen, there's still some things that we got to tweak a little bit in here. Okay. He's moving back, but it snaps forward. Okay. But see how it keeps moving back? Okay. And it's not really changing when we're reacting. Okay. So we do have it snapping forward. Let's make a little bit of more of a change. We want to, when we reset that position, based off that home position, and we could actually use this right here. Instead of writing it like this, why don't we write it the smarter way? So we could write this dot reset position. That's what we did before. And we could pass in the home position. So this dot home position dot x, and then we could do null for our y. That should act the same way. Let's double check. Okay, and that's a better way for us to code it because now we're reusing that function that we've already created. And so now we want to basically change our velocity because this is us returning to home and resetting. So we could do this dot velocity dot x is now set back to 0 and wait for the next hit. So let's see that happen. but now I'm not reacting anymore, okay? And that's because when I look here, this force pushback, it starts as true. That's what allowed it to fire. We changed it to false. We need to now reset it back to true so we could get back into this again, okay? So we got to go down to when we're resetting we're returning to home, we're resetting our position, we're resetting our velocity, and we are going to do our force push back done is going to be true, okay? Now let's check that happening. Okay, it's doing it. Now we need a tweak, okay? I think when we want a force pushback, it shouldn't be something slow. It should be something pretty quick. Let's try to increase that value. We want this to move real fast. Let's try again. And this is all just kind of playing around with the mechanics to get a good feel. There we go. We move back real quick. As soon as we're greater than 50, then we're dealing with it. Maybe I don't want it to push back as far. I make this number smaller. I like 50. These are actually the original values that I have. But let's try maybe 30. So that'll be real split second. That one's okay too. If I have this larger, it's going to take me approximately 3 frames for it to go. I don't like that one as much. So you're going to end up getting a feel based off what you want. 30 I think actually looks pretty good. I want it to be somewhat quick. Okay, so you guys can play with these values. I'm not going to be super specific on it, but I do want to see some type of feedback that the player is reacting to getting hit. Now, could there be other things that we're doing? I'm doing force pushback. We could have, if you wanted to keep the sensors, which realistically we're not going to keep these sensors going, we're only using them as part of a debug. If I was looking at my dynamic creature, the dynamic creature is displaying these sensors. If I don't want to actually see them, I just comment out my display. I'm still updating all of them. Now this is more like game development. They're all still there. They're all still working. Okay. But maybe you did want to have a couple sensors. Maybe you did want to have some glowing orb or something, and that orb changes colors. Maybe you wanted to change the colors and make the ninja themselves change colors in the animations or switch out an animation. Doesn't matter what you're doing. You just want to build that in. We're just looking for the collision and then we're dealing with it. Okay, so that actually is the end of the video for, and I'm going to turn this back on because we'll use it on different ones, for the player reacting to the enemy. The next one that we're going to do is a player reacting to ground platforms, which means that we're going to actually have to change quite a bit of code because we want to build a ground and build platforms. Our player should be moving across those platforms, and we got to change the sizes of them. Okay, so that's the next video that we're going to be doing. Good luck. Have fun.